Reference architectures and blueprints can feel like a gift to a new security architect because they look like ready-made answers that save you time and reduce uncertainty. In this episode, we focus on how to use those resources wisely so they accelerate your work without quietly dragging in risks, gaps, or unrealistic expectations that do not fit your environment. A reference architecture is a reusable model that shows a typical structure for solving a class of problems, while a blueprint often adds more detail about patterns, components, and recommended practices. These resources are valuable because they reflect experience and tested patterns, and they can give teams a shared starting point rather than endless debate. The danger is that every reference design includes assumptions, and some assumptions are hidden, meaning they are not stated clearly but are still required for the design to work safely. When you copy a blueprint without discovering its assumptions, you can build a system that looks aligned with best practice but fails under audit, fails under real threat, or fails operationally when constraints differ. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to begin is to understand why reference architectures exist and what problem they are meant to solve, because that keeps you from using them like a checklist. Organizations and standards bodies create reference architectures to capture common approaches that work across many environments, so teams do not have to reinvent patterns each time. They also serve as a communication tool, because a reference model can help different groups agree on boundaries, roles, and core capabilities like identity, monitoring, segmentation, and evidence. A blueprint can also help speed delivery by offering a sequence of design moves that are known to work together, reducing the chance that you implement a strong control in one area while leaving a gap elsewhere. Beginners sometimes assume that using a reference architecture guarantees security, but the guarantee is only that the pattern is plausible, not that it fits your specific risks and constraints. Real security is contextual, meaning it depends on what assets you protect, what threats you face, what obligations you must meet, and what you can operate reliably. Reference materials are therefore inputs to thinking, not replacements for thinking. When you treat them as starting points, you can benefit from their structure while still designing responsibly. Hidden assumptions are the most important risk to understand, and they appear in several predictable forms that you can learn to recognize. One form is trust assumptions, such as assuming that internal networks are safe, that administrative access is tightly controlled, or that service identities are managed consistently. Another form is capability assumptions, such as assuming that the organization has strong monitoring, a mature operations team, or a reliable change management process that prevents drift. There are also scale and performance assumptions, such as assuming the environment can handle certain overhead or that teams can maintain complex segmentation rules without constant exceptions. Compliance assumptions are common too, such as assuming certain logging retention and evidence practices already exist, or that data classification is already defined and consistently used. If those assumptions are not true, the reference design may be incomplete or may even be dangerous because it creates a false sense of safety. Beginners often miss assumptions because the diagram looks clean and the document sounds confident, but diagrams rarely show operational maturity and governance realities. Your job is to make assumptions visible before you adopt the pattern. The first safe habit for using reference architectures is to treat them as hypotheses that must be validated against your environment, rather than as instructions that must be followed exactly. Validation starts by comparing the reference design's goals to your goals, because a blueprint may be optimized for a specific objective, such as rapid scalability, strong compliance evidence, or high availability. If your primary objective differs, you may need to adjust the pattern. You also validate against your threat realities, because a blueprint built around perimeter defenses may not be sufficient when your most likely attacks involve credential theft and lateral movement. You validate against your asset profile, because a design that protects public data might not be sufficient when you handle sensitive personal data or critical mission systems. Finally, you validate against your operational constraints, because a pattern that requires constant manual review might fail in an organization that cannot sustain that workload. This validation does not have to be complicated, but it must be intentional because the point is to prevent copying assumptions you cannot meet. When validation is part of your process, you use reference architectures as accelerators rather than as shortcuts that create hidden risk. Another important skill is understanding what parts of a reference architecture are structural and what parts are optional, because not every detail has the same importance. Structural elements are the decisions that make the pattern safe, such as clear trust boundaries, identity enforcement points, and evidence flows that support accountability. Optional elements are often specific choices that can vary, such as where a certain monitoring function is placed or how a redundancy pattern is implemented in a particular environment. Beginners sometimes focus on the visible components and miss the structural intent, like copying a network diagram while ignoring the identity and authorization assumptions that make it work. A better approach is to first restate the pattern's intent in your own words, such as this design assumes tight separation between public interfaces and sensitive services, with consistent identity and strong logging. Once you can articulate intent, you can choose implementation details that fit your environment while preserving the safety properties the pattern was meant to provide. This also helps you explain your design to reviewers because you can show you adopted the pattern for its security outcomes, not because it looked official. Preserving intent is the key to using reference designs responsibly. Reference architectures are especially useful for creating a baseline, meaning a set of default expectations that teams can follow consistently across many systems. A baseline can include default segmentation principles, default logging and evidence requirements, default identity integration expectations, and default requirements for protecting sensitive data. The baseline approach is powerful because it reduces decision fatigue and speeds delivery, but it also amplifies the risk of hidden assumptions, because a baseline applied broadly can spread a flaw quickly. Architects must therefore be careful when turning reference designs into internal standards, ensuring the baseline is realistic for the organization's maturity and that exceptions are managed intentionally. A baseline should also include clear scope, meaning where it applies and where additional controls are required, such as higher assurance systems or systems with special regulatory obligations. Beginners sometimes believe a baseline means one size fits all, but mature baselines are tiered and risk-based, applying stronger requirements where the impact is higher. This prevents over-engineering low-risk systems while still protecting high-value assets. When baselines are grounded in validated reference patterns, they become both practical and defensible. A common hidden assumption in many blueprints is that identity is handled consistently and that authorization is enforced at the right places, especially in distributed systems. A diagram may show services communicating and may imply that authentication happens at the edge, but if internal services do not enforce authorization, attackers can exploit weak internal boundaries. Similarly, a blueprint may assume that service identities are managed well and that secrets are rotated and scoped, but if secrets are reused broadly, compromise of one service can become compromise of many. Architects should therefore evaluate reference designs through an identity lens by asking how identities are established, how privileges are granted, and where authorization decisions are made. You also ask how accountability is preserved, meaning whether actions can be traced to individuals or services and whether logs capture the right events. Beginners sometimes assume that network segmentation alone provides protection, but modern environments often require identity-based enforcement to match threat realities. When you inspect identity assumptions explicitly, you prevent the most common kinds of hidden gaps that appear when patterns are copied too literally. This is one of the strongest ways to use reference design safely. Another frequent hidden assumption is monitoring and evidence maturity, because many reference designs assume robust observability that may not exist in a given organization. A blueprint might include strong logging and monitoring as a box on a diagram, but the real question is whether the organization can collect, retain, correlate, and protect that evidence consistently. If logs are not centralized, if retention is inconsistent, or if privileged administrators can delete evidence, the design may not meet auditability or forensics requirements even if it includes the right control labels. Architects must therefore evaluate evidence flows as part of adopting reference architectures, ensuring that the design includes not only collection but also integrity protection and traceability. You also consider privacy, because evidence systems can capture sensitive data and reference designs may not emphasize the need to minimize sensitive content in logs. If you adopt a blueprint that increases logging without controlling access and retention, you can create new exposure while trying to improve audit readiness. The safer approach is to treat evidence as a designed pipeline with ownership, protection, and lifecycle controls. When evidence assumptions are validated, reference designs become far more valuable and far less risky. Operational assumptions are another area where copied blueprints often fail, because a pattern can be technically sound, yet operationally unrealistic for the organization. Some reference architectures assume frequent and disciplined patching, strict configuration management, and strong review processes that prevent drift. If your organization cannot sustain those practices, the architecture will degrade over time and the security outcomes will not hold. Architects should therefore ask what operational behaviors the pattern depends on, such as regular access reviews, strict separation of duties, or rapid response to vulnerabilities. If those behaviors are weak, the architecture should include compensating design features that reduce reliance on perfect human behavior, such as stronger defaults, stronger isolation, and more automated verification of baseline settings. Beginners sometimes assume operations will adapt to the architecture automatically, but reality is that architecture must fit the organization's ability to operate it. If the architecture is too complex, teams will create exceptions, and those exceptions become the gaps attackers exploit. A reference architecture should therefore be filtered through an operability lens, asking whether the pattern will still be followed during outages, emergencies, and staffing changes. When operability is considered, adoption becomes smoother and security outcomes become more durable. Reference designs can also hide assumptions about compliance scope and regulatory obligations, especially when they are written for generic audiences. A blueprint may assume a certain data classification scheme or certain retention periods, but your organization may have different obligations based on geography, industry, or customer contracts. Architects must map the reference design's control expectations to their own compliance requirements, ensuring that mandatory obligations are met and that evidence can be produced in the required form. This is where traceability becomes important, because you may adopt a pattern but tailor it, and you must document why tailoring occurred and how compliance is still achieved. Beginners sometimes think tailoring is a sign of weakness, but responsible tailoring is often necessary because no reference design can anticipate every environment. The key is that tailoring must preserve security intent and satisfy obligations, not weaken controls quietly. If a reference architecture assumes a certain audit model but your auditors require a different evidence style, you must adjust the design so evidence flows match what will actually be reviewed. When compliance assumptions are made explicit, adopting reference designs becomes a strength rather than a vulnerability. A disciplined way to use reference architectures without copying hidden assumptions is to create a short adaptation record that captures what you adopted, what you changed, and why. The record should include the security outcomes the reference design was meant to achieve, the assumptions you validated, and any gaps you found that required additional controls or different patterns. It should also capture ownership, meaning who is responsible for maintaining the pattern, reviewing exceptions, and updating it when threats or services change. This is not about creating paperwork. It is about preserving decision traceability so future teams understand why the pattern looks the way it does. The record also helps with audits because it shows that the organization did not blindly copy a blueprint, but applied informed judgment and validated assumptions. During incident scrutiny, it helps investigators understand intended boundaries and control placements, which can speed response and reduce confusion. Beginners often underestimate how quickly context is lost when staff changes, and an adaptation record protects that context. When you pair a reference design with a clear adaptation story, you make it safer to reuse and easier to defend. Using reference architectures responsibly also means avoiding a false sense of completeness, because diagrams can make systems look more controlled than they are. A reference architecture might show a secure boundary, but if an exception allows broad access around that boundary, the security outcome is not actually achieved. It might show a monitoring layer, but if events are not correlated or reviewed, the monitoring does not create real protection. Architects should therefore treat reference designs as requiring verification, meaning you confirm that the key security properties are actually present in the implemented system and remain present over time. This often includes reviewing whether trust boundaries are enforced, whether identity and authorization are consistent, whether logs are complete and protected, and whether operational processes support the pattern. Verification is not an extra burden. It is the only way to ensure that a pattern is real rather than decorative. Beginners sometimes believe that adopting a pattern means the work is done, but in architecture the work is done only when the pattern is operating and evidence supports that claim. This is how you prevent the gap between diagram security and real security, which is a common source of audit findings and incidents. Responsible use of reference designs includes building confidence through verification. When you choose between reference architectures, you should also consider how well each one matches your threat realities and your maturity, because some patterns are excellent but assume capabilities you do not yet have. A highly granular segmentation pattern may be strong, but if your organization cannot manage the complexity, a simpler pattern with strong identity enforcement and good monitoring may be safer in practice. A blueprint that assumes perfect configuration management may fail in a fast-moving environment unless you add drift detection and strong defaults. A pattern that is optimized for performance may assume minimal inspection and may not be appropriate for sensitive data workloads without additional controls. The best choice is often the pattern that your organization can operate reliably while still reducing the most important risks. This is a mature security idea that beginners sometimes resist because it feels like compromising, but it is actually a way to make security real rather than theoretical. If you pick a pattern you cannot sustain, it will break and you will lose trust. If you pick a pattern that fits your capabilities, you can strengthen it over time as maturity improves. Reference architectures are therefore not just technical templates. They are maturity-aligned design choices. To conclude, using reference architectures and blueprints without copying hidden assumptions means treating them as valuable starting points that must be validated, adapted, and verified in your specific environment. You begin by clarifying the intent of the pattern and identifying the assumptions it depends on, including trust boundaries, identity consistency, monitoring maturity, operability, and compliance obligations. You preserve structural safety properties while tailoring optional details to fit your constraints, and you create baselines carefully so they speed delivery without spreading weaknesses. You inspect identity, evidence flows, and operational behaviors explicitly because those are where hidden assumptions most often live, and you ensure that auditing and forensics needs are supported through reliable, protected records. You document your adaptations so decisions remain traceable and defensible during audits and incidents, and you verify that the implemented system truly reflects the pattern's intent over time. When you approach reference designs this way, you get the best of both worlds: faster architecture work based on proven patterns and safer outcomes because you did not import invisible risks along with the diagram.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.